Hello, I'm Geeta Gurumurthy. It is now time for your questions answered. Well, of course, it's been a huge week in the political calendar with the general election finally being called for July the 4th. Thank you for getting in touch with the BBC for your questions about all of that. And with me to try and answer as many of them as possible are three guests. Joe Twyman from Delta Poll, which is the public opinion consultancy, our own political correspondent Harry Farley, and Ben Paxton from the Institute for Government. Welcome to all of you this afternoon. Thanks for being with us. Well, we've had a few questions and we're going to start with Ben, and a question for you because, of course, this comes in July, this vote. Often we have votes in May or perhaps potentially in the autumn, but July, not a common date. It is holiday season for many parts of the UK. And there's a question from Lynn, aged 83, who's asking, how do I vote if I'm on holiday? Can I apply for a postal vote?
So that's a great question. So yeah, this is the first July election we've had since 1945 in the UK. So if you're on holiday, there's two ways you can vote. You can apply for a postal vote, or you can get someone to vote on your behalf via a proxy vote. Now, polling day is on the 4th of July, but to do both of those things, you're going to need to apply beforehand. So for postal votes, you'll need to have applied by the 19th of June. And for a proxy vote, you'll need to have applied by the 26th of June. So you need to get a move on if you're on holiday, and that's something you're planning to do.
OK, we are all taking note of that. Another question, Joe, for you, if I can. Someone's called in to ask, could there be a coalition government? Obviously, at the moment, there's a huge poll lead for the Labour Party, but could we be seeing a coalition government in July?
Well, if the last 10 years of British politics have taught us anything, it's that nothing can be ruled out. But I do think it's, at the moment, looking unlikely. Polling is only ever a snapshot of public opinion at the given time, and the campaign could have a big effect on things and change the story entirely. But as things stand at the moment, it's looking good for Labour. They need to gain more than 120 seats at the election, and by historical standards, that's a huge amount. Now, opinions differ on exactly what kind of swing will be needed to achieve that. But at the upper end of the estimates, it's said that a swing of around about 12%, in excess of 12%, will be required to get a majority just of 2. Now, by historical standards, again, that's a large number. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but it is larger than Tony Blair achieved in 1997, for instance, which is the largest in post-war history up until this point, and by some distance. But in order to become to get into hung parliament territory, they only need, it's estimated, a swing of around about 4%, which is perfectly reasonable by historical standards. And so I think hung parliament, though unlikely, could happen, but far more likely, based on the polling that we're seeing at the moment, based on the size of the leads and how long those leads have lasted, it's looking like a less likely option.
And Joe, just very quickly, just to follow up on that, has there been any movement in the last 2 days since the announcement was made in the rain outside Downing Street?
Well, not only has there not been much movement in the last couple of days, there really hasn't been much movement for a very long time. The Conservatives have been behind in every single published poll since December 2021, and Labour have had a double-digit lead since September 2022. And so these trends are long-lasting, and the gap is large and continues to be so. We will wait and see if it changes during the campaign, but no movement so far.
OK. Harry, let me bring you in with a question linking a couple of our really big stories here in the UK at the moment. We've got a question asking, will the election delay, obviously Parliament is breaking up today, will the election delay compensation for victims of the infected blood scandal and the post office scandal?
Well, there's a lot of political will across the different parties to see those compensations for both for the victims of that Post Office Horizon scheme that you mentioned and the victims of the infected blood scandal. A lot of will across the parties to see those happen. In the last couple of days, we've seen bills that would allow those compensation schemes to go ahead. They've been passed. It's called the wash-up process, basically where existing government bills are sort of rushed through in the last couple of days before Parliament finishes sitting this evening. So those two bills are are being passed as we speak. I think possibly in the last few minutes, one of them might have just passed as well. So I think so those compensation packages will go ahead. The legislation to enable them to do so is being passed right now, I think.
And we know that some things in the wash-up area, Harry, or some of the bills that we're going through have gone. It represents a huge amount of work, doesn't it, by a lot of people? So it's quite extraordinary, really. And we'll know by 6 o'clock, presumably, what other bills do go through. Is that right?
Yes, roughly around then. A lot of work, as you say, Gita, but also a lot of government promises. For example, the government promised from the 2019 manifesto to end no-fault evictions for renters. That's the one that stops landlords evicting tenants without having to give a reason. That was promised by the Conservatives back in 2019. A bill to enable that to happen was introduced to the House of Commons more than a year ago, but that will now not go through. That is a victim of, as you say, that wash-up process. Another promise that Rishi Sunak made was to create the first smoke-free generation. That was a legislation to try and gradually phase out smoking, gradually make it illegal for people to smoke. That now won't happen either. He said he's disappointed that won't happen, but there's perhaps an indication that might well be something that's in the Conservative manifesto, if, of course, the Conservatives get back into government on July the 4th. But as we've been hearing, that is a big if at this stage.
Thank you, Harry. Ben, can I just bring you in with one that sort of links to that? A question asking what happens to Parliament before the election?
Yes, so the election was called a couple of days ago now by the Prime Minister, and then we enter that wash-up period, as just been said, and that's going to was just 2 days for this time round. Parliament will be prorogued this evening, which means MPs will stop sitting in the House of Commons, and then next Thursday Parliament gets dissolved, and at that point MPs cease to be MPs, they just become candidates, and there is no MPs representing us specifically because the campaign's begun. That also starts the 25 working day countdown to polling day itself, and that's then 5 weeks. So then we have polling day on the 4th of July, then Parliament meets a few days later to get things going again.
And just to follow up on that for everyone looking at a summer ahead and the autumn, Parliament returns and then what, we'll go into normal recess for August and then, party conferences back in September. Is that what happens?
I don't think we actually have the final dates of when this is all going to happen. I don't think the recess dates have been finalised, and we may not know that for a little bit longer yet.
Okay.
Party conferences equally, I think, are a bit up in the air at the moment.
Okay. Let us move on to another question. Joe, if I can ask you, could there be a pact between the Conservatives and Reform UK? That question's also come into us.
Well, that's a really good question. There could be, but I think a formal pact is unlikely. Though some, particularly in the Conservative ranks, might actually look to embrace such an idea. I think the leadership of both parties have previously ruled it out and may well do again. But there's of course a distinction between a formal pact where one party agrees not to fight a particular constituency and let the other have a free run, and then the sort of informal agreements where one party might prefer to just not try as hard, basically. But I think in both cases it's unlikely to make a major difference because whereas Reform UK may take some votes from the Conservatives, of course it's not the Conservatives in a lot of these constituencies they need to beat, it's Labour. And so if you look at something like the Blackpool South by-election, the Conservatives only narrowly held off Reform, with Reform coming in third there. But Labour was so far ahead that even if all of the Reform voters had voted Conservative, which of course was never going to happen, they still wouldn't have beaten Labour in a constituency that in many ways is almost designed for Reform to do well based on the demographics and the previous voting patterns. And so maybe there'll be some ad hoc, unofficial agreements not to perhaps go quite as hard as they might in particular constituencies, but I think a formal pact with this particular government in Downing Street I think is unlikely. But after the election, well, we'll just have to wait and see.
Harry, a question for you. How long have the Tories been in power?
Well, the Conservatives have been in government for 14 years, since 2010. Of course, remember the first 5 years of that they were in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. That means they were the largest party, but they didn't have an overall majority of MPs. So they needed a coalition agreement with another party, in this case the Liberal Democrats, in order to create that majority that enabled them to pass laws. And then it's since 2015 that they've been in overall power themselves in government and in the majority in the House of Commons. Of course, before that, Labour in power for 13 years, from 1997 until 2010. So Rishi Sunak, I suppose that's one of the challenges for him in many ways for this election campaign. He's not just standing on the record of the time that he's been in charge, that he's been Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party. In many ways, he's also being judged on the record of his predecessors as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, going back to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, of course, Theresa May and David Cameron before that. So I think that's perhaps one of the challenges that he faces. He's not just standing on his own record, he's also standing on the record of the last 14 years of Conservative-led government.
And Harry, just to continue with that, we have seen a lot of MPs, I think over 100 now, standing down. And people like Harriet Harman, I think she's the longest serving MP in the House at the moment, certainly female member of the House, of course, giving their farewell speeches, and most of them will not have seen this coming, that this was going to be the last day, because once the May date as a potential election date passed, people then sort of started to assume that it was probably going to be autumn. So, we've also seen Craig McKinley, who made that amazing appearance a couple of days ago, saying, sadly, reluctantly, he doesn't feel he can fight another campaign.
Yes, that's right. A number of MPs, even in the last 24 hours, announcing that they're stepping down. We already, as you say, had more than 100 MPs, not just from the Conservatives, from across the political divide, Labour as well, MPs announcing they're retiring or moving on to other things. And as you say, whatever happens after this election, whoever wins, whoever is the largest party, the makeup of the House of Commons will look very different, because regardless, as I say, of who wins and the result of the election, there will be an awful lot of new MPs, simply by virtue of the fact that so many are retiring or moving on to do something different. I think one thing that's been noticeable is how many MPs have spoken about the difficulties they've faced, perhaps balancing their life as an MP with family matters, or even and indeed concerned about their security. So a big churn will take place in the House of Commons, whatever the result of the election on July the 4th.
Yeah, the young MP for Labour MP, I think, for Halifax, she's standing now, she's got a young child and is expecting another, and just feels she can't balance the life of an MP with everything else that she's got to do as a family person. And that is a really, really big question, isn't it, about who goes into politics, who can afford to go into politics, who can make it work. And we need, of course, people of the highest calibre for all of our sakes. Ben, let me ask you a question. Why has Rishi Sunak called a general election in the summer?
So Rishi Sunak had the choice to call an election any time and hold it any time up to the end of January. He's done 6 months or more before that. It was always a difficult decision to make. Do you call an election from the current position you're in, even if the polls show you're behind, like Joe has explained earlier, or wait and hope that the polls have improved? Rishi Sunak's judged that this is the right time for him. A big factor in any election is the economy, and we know it's a big concern for voters this time round. It's notable that the announcement of the election did come on the same day that the latest inflation figures were announced, and that showed inflation was at 2.3%, quite close to the Bank of England target of 2%. But of course, there's lots of factors, and I'm not sure anyone but the PM and the people closest to him really know exactly why, even though there will be lots of speculation, I'm sure, in the coming weeks.
And Harry, just on that, I was talking to Nick Eardley, who's travelling with the Prime Minister at the moment, about that, because Nadine Dorries had mischievously tweeted that the real reason for the for the July date was because US schools terms start in August, and if Sunak doesn't win the election, then he'll, all the speculation is, all the questions about whether he's going to relocate back to California where he met his wife. That is a bit mischievous, it's private, but people have many, many reasons, don't they, for making these decisions. And there's a lot of frustration amongst Tory MPs saying, look, we're so far behind in the polls. Every, percentage point that shifts means that really, really affects someone's job, because you're out of a job if you lose your seat.
Yes, that's completely right. A lot of Tory MPs expressing their concerns, shall we say, both privately and publicly, it's worth saying, after that early election was called. One cabinet minister texted me to say, well, it's a brave decision to go early. I think the reality is that a lot of those people closest to Rishi Sunak, Oliver Dowden, who's known to be one of his closest friends in politics, one of his closest political allies, has long been making the case for going early. The argument is that I suppose that you're seen to be seizing the initiative. You look like you're stronger perhaps if you decide to go early. But as you say, many of his backbenchers, many Conservative MPs, very concerned that he's chosen to go early when, as we've been hearing, there is such a large gap in the polling. It's worth saying though, polling is just polling. There's only one poll that matters, and as we've seen from previous elections, a lot can change in 6 weeks.
Absolutely. And Joe, just to bring you in on your specialist subject, how reliable are general election polls? What is a bellwether seat? A couple of questions there.
Oh well, I'll answer the second one first. A bellwether seat is a seat that matches the overall result, and so when the Conservatives are in power, that particular seat will go to the Conservatives, and when Labour are in power, that seat will go to Labour. And so, with the new boundaries that have come into force, it does get more confusing this time around. And so, you'll have to forgive me if I can't name the individual constituencies under the new boundaries that would be bellwethers this time, but they will be out there. So take a look for them. And how accurate are polls? Well, as I say, polls are only a snapshot of public opinion at the time, and so at the moment we are not seeking to predict where we think the general election result will be, because we still have 6 weeks remaining, and as we know, 1 week is a long time in politics. But what I can say is that final election polls, historically speaking, tend to be quite close. Though there are exceptions, 4 out of 5 times they tend to be within the margin of error, which is usually around plus or minus 2%. Now, in a close election, that could mean the difference between one party winning and the other party winning. But at the moment, the lead that Labour have is substantial in all of the polling, and indeed the kind of gains that parties have made in election campaigns in the past are not large enough to offset that lead, even if you factor in the largest ever polling miss, though I'm ashamed even to mention it, from back in 1992. So even if you get the largest movement that we've seen in a campaign plus the largest polling miss, you still see Labour being probably the largest party in a hung parliament, which would be enough to get Keir Starmer into Downing Street.
Yeah, and of course people have pointed out that even if that happened, even if there was a sort of no clear majority, it's not likely that the Lib Dems would prop up a Tory government, and therefore it's unlikely, and it's very, very difficult to see a return for the Tories. Although I should say that the Prime Minister, in his briefing to journalists on the plane on his travels today, is in fighting spirit. So, of course, we will only know the outcome on July the 5th. Ben, if I can ask you a few procedural questions that we've had in. So, people obviously suddenly having to take this seriously, that they are now going to be able to cast a vote for the government of their choice, for the MP of their choice. So we're getting questions like, how do you apply for a postal vote? Who can vote in the general election? And how do I know who my MP is and what constituency I'm in?
So these are all great questions and really important for people to be asking. So postal votes and proxy votes, and to register to vote itself, you can do online. If you just Google register to vote or postal votes on the gov.uk website, you should be able to find the information there. If you're not able to use the internet for whatever reason, you can ring or get in touch with your local electoral office, who'll be able to provide further information. And then, what was your second question? Sorry, I was thinking about Dave.
My second question was, someone asked what constituency and who's my MP? And who can vote? Who is allowed to vote?
Really important question with those boundary changes that have been mentioned. So, out of the 533 constituencies in England, I don't have the figures for elsewhere in the UK, almost all of those are changing boundaries in the next election. I think there's only about 50 that are remaining unchanged. So you may well be in a new constituency. You can find that information online. Again, there's you can go on the .gov.uk website, or Democracy Club is a place that gather all this information online. You can find out where your polling station is and who the candidates are in your local area.
Okay. And do these boundary changes, I mean, obviously they are presumably designed to be fair to all parties, but is there an argument about whether they favour one party or another? Ben?
I think that's quite hard to say. They're designed in a way such that they're hoping not to produce a big change, but it's very difficult to say at this stage how that will affect the election result, although I'm sure there'll be lots of speculation in the weeks ahead and after the election about that.
Absolutely, I'm sure there will. Someone's asked, when was the last general election? Harry?
General election was in 2019, almost, as we were hearing earlier, almost 5 years ago. The deadline legally for when the next election has to be is the end of January in 2025. But as we were hearing, Rishi Sunak decided to go slightly earlier. But it has been almost 5 years since the last election.
And Harry, another one for you if I can. What is the Blue Coast, and why has Ed Davey focused on going to the south of England?
So Ed Davey is the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party. He is going to the south coast of England and also, I suppose it's fair to say, the southwest of England as well, because those are the areas that he is hoping and expecting to win the most seats. The Liberal Democrats tend to be popular in those kind of parts of England in particular, also in some areas of Scotland. So I suppose he's focusing his energies, his campaigning on those areas, those particular constituencies that he thinks he can win. So we saw him, for example, in Cheltenham yesterday, and I think and as you say, he's down on the south coast today in Eastbourne, another seat that he thinks the Liberal Democrats can win off the Conservatives. There are, of course, other seats around the country where perhaps the Liberal Democrats face less of a chance. Perhaps they're coming in third or fourth, and they're more of a straight fight between Labour and the Conservatives. So it's worth, as we were hearing earlier, checking what constituency you're in, checking who is standing in your constituency, in your area, before you decide who to vote for.
Absolutely. Joe, I'm going to ask you a couple if I can. We've been asked, when will we know the final result? And we've also been asked, do we know who's going to win?
Well, as I said, if the last 10 years of British politics have taught us anything, it's that nothing can be taken for granted. But if you take 3 different points of evidence, the current polling trends, the historical precedent, and the most recent set of election results with mayoral, local and by-elections that we had recently, if you look at all of those, they all point to a Labour victory. It's unlikely to be the sort of large 3-figure majority that the current polling suggests, because we would, by historical precedent, expect at least some contraction in the polls during the campaign, not least from people who in other times would say, oh, I don't know who I'm going to vote for, but then actually make up their mind one way or another. But that contraction is unlikely to be enough to change the overall story. Instead, it is pointing at the moment, and I do stress at the moment, it's pointing to a Labour victory of a size. And then with regards to the first question, which I've forgotten.
It was when will we know? Because obviously there are calculations, aren't there? Because the results come in obviously overnight on the 4th. Polls close at 10 o'clock. We'll all be up working on or watching that programme and or those programmes. And I'm sure, at what point in the night do you think we will know, or do you think we'll have to wait till the morning? Because if Labour have a massive majority, obviously you'd know fairly early. If it's tighter, you'd have to wait, presumably.
And yes, and that's what I was going to say. If it is a hung parliament, which, as I say, I don't think is a likely option at all, but if it is a hung parliament, we may not know the overall result in terms of who's actually going into Downing Street for a couple of days and perhaps even longer. But assuming that's not the case, we should know at some point in the early hours of the morning. Of course, if you're Sir John Curtis, and one of his colleagues on the exit poll, you may well know by around about lunchtime on polling day. But for those of us mere mortals, the exit poll will be announced at 10 o'clock on election night. That will give an indication, and then as the results come in, it will further confirm or indeed deny that the election is going along the lines of the exit poll. And so, as results start to come in, we should get a few from Sunderland and Newcastle within sort of 45 minutes to an hour, but the bulk of results will come in from sort of 3 a.m. onwards. And I imagine that relatively quickly, if it is a large Labour victory, we will know. So I would estimate that by sort of 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday, the 4th of July, we'll know.
5th of July.
5th, yes.
Joe Twyman, Ben Paxton, Harry Farley. There's lots of games being played amongst those who like these things, working out majorities or hung parliament numbers or whatever. But we will find out very soon in 6 weeks. Thank you all very much indeed. Let's get.